Sit back and relax because this module is going to take us a little bit of time to work our way through. It's how you configure your webinar. So this is basically the administrative setup for your webinar. Now, we're not talking about content at this point. We're talking about the administration. We're talking about the registration form. We're talking about the date and the time of the webinar and the communication with the participants of the webinar, both presenters and audience within the webinar. So we're talking about all of that administrative detail. Now, depending on which webinar package you use, you will find a variety of different tools and a variety of different options in order to facilitate this. But they're all going to have a few things in common, or they should all have a few things in common. The ability to create a few different styles of webinars, the ability to create accounts and logins for guests and for participants and hosts, and to incorporate any assets that you're going to be putting into the webinar, such as slideshows or videos or audio, anything along that line. Any inclusions, such as offers, calls to action, graphics that you're going to be inserting within the webinar. And also, hopefully, some sort of a communication tool that will allow you to reach out and engage in a dialogue and a reminder system to remind participants and get them into the room. Because it's one thing to get people to register. It's an entirely other thing to have them actually in the webinar. And for free webinars, if you have a show up rate of anything over 20%, you're actually doing quite well. But I think that by concentrating on making sure that the proper pieces are in place, you can increase that percentage. And the higher the percentage of people showing up for your webinars, I mean, that's just good business because you've gone through all of the effort to put everything else in place. You've actually got the people registering. Darn it, let's get them in live, shall we? The other thing that this console should do, or the initial setup should do, is it should also set the stage for our post-webinar follow-up, whether or not people see a webinar replay, whether they get a resource page or some other engagement and follow-up. And they should create some sort of an opportunity for us to create a longer-term relationship with the people in the webinar by creating some integration between the webinar itself and our CRM, or our customer relationship management system, or our email system, wherever we hold those people, so that we can communicate with them in the future. So let's just dive in. And for the basis for this one here, let's just use the webinar, which is this one's a little bit unique in the fact that it was originally a revenue webinar, but meaning I charged for the webinar, as those of you who participated in the webinar know, and those of you who have come later to just take the course. The entire course is, of course, based on a webinar which we charged for right at the beginning when we delivered it. But this is the actual configuration module for the webinar when we first delivered it. So what you see here within Webinar Jam Studio is they have a metaphor, which is kind of working your way towards success by making sure you hit each of these check marks along the way as you build each of the modules one after the other and put them in place. So you set your basic configuration and your schedule. The first place that we really have to have a conversation is the schedule, because the schedule will determine, obviously, when the webinar is delivered. And here you have to determine time zone and make sure that it's accurate in time zone. And here's a tip for you for a successful webinar, is make sure that you, in your marketing materials, mention several time zones that most of your people are in. I think it's almost impossible to make everybody happy. If you're delivering a webinar from North America, your European or your Asian fans are going to have a lot of math to do to kind of figure out what the time is. But most of them should be fairly comfortable with that translation now, making sure you have Pacific and East Coast time in your webinar description. And also the webinar software itself, Webinar Jam Studio, for example, if you use their scheduling tool, they will localize it based on the local time clock of the people that are registering. There still is the odd snafu, but for the most part, it works pretty well. Now, one thing to consider here is the type of webinar you're delivering, whether it's a single presentation or a series of presentations. And this can get slightly confusing because some people, say if they're launching a product, will have a series of the same webinars. That's not a series. That's actually just a single presentation done several times. A series of webinars is if I was to have a four-part webinar series where I was going to have an introduction first, then a basic, then an advanced, then a Q&A, say webinars over 4 weeks. That's where I would set up a series. That way people only have to register once, but they're enrolled in all 4 webinars downstream. So those are the 2 different styles of webinars that you create. You select the time, and then you save them, and then basically the webinar schedule is in place, and you're ready to proceed to the next step. Now, the cool thing about this process is each of the steps that we take here as we set these different parameters in place basically gets reflected through when we start talking about our email follow-up sequences and our landing pages or registration pages. So you don't have to enter the title or the people that are presenting the webinar in multiple places. What happens is the software pulls all of this information through into the appropriate communications downstream through something called shortcodes. So by creating the webinar and all of the administrative details in a wizard like this one here, we basically reduce the number of steps and the possibility of confusion as we start to automate different parts of the webinar communication process farther down the channel. And I hope that makes sense. If not, it will certainly in a few moments when you see where these different shortcodes are enacted. Next, you set up who your presenters are for any one particular webinar, and you just basically set them up, and you can determine whether a person's an active speaker or they're only in kind of a producer working back of house. One of the things that I like about Webinar Jam Studio is it's one of the only packages that has a discrete administration module separate from the presentation module when we're actually delivering. It's one of the reasons I do like parts of this tool, so we'll be touching on how that all works later. But in our particular case, it was just Jen and myself, and I like to have Jen on camera with me, so she is an active presenter. So again, putting in her email address, setting her up allows us to then, it carries through into all of the different registration information, but also when I go to automatically send out all the links for people to jump on the webinar in the appropriate format for her to jump on as a presenter rather than as a viewer, that's all taken care of there through that presenter module. Now we get into registrations, and the registration page is probably the area that I spend most of my time when I'm setting up a webinar, at least the administrative side, because having a good registration page is essential for people to actually sign up for a webinar. And look here, in Webinar Jam Studio, they actually have these are pre-done landing pages. Now, most packages will have them that you can host, share a URL that is the landing page or the registration page being hosted by Webinar Jam Studio. And these little percentages they tell us, that's the actual conversion rate of the number of people who visit that page versus the number of people that sign up for the webinars. And you'll notice there's a pretty big discrepancy between the top performing ones and the poorest performing ones. You want to make sure that you have a registration page that encourages people to subscribe to the webinar, or the right people to subscribe. So you have to share a fair bit of very relevant information in your landing or on your landing page, to the point where I often create videos to describe exactly what you're going to get within a webinar. Now, in the case of this particular webinar that we're looking at right here, this was a revenue webinar, which means my landing page was almost a sales page. Now, I didn't flesh it out as much as a normal sales page, but I had to provide a lot of information because I was asking for money. I wasn't just asking you to sign up for free without it costing you anything, but we were actually asking for money. So you can use one of their pre-done templates, which is a great way to start out, or when I go in, I chose this option here, which was to use my own web page. Now, this is a much more sophisticated way to do things, but in my mind, this is what separates, kind of the real professional as far as webinars from everybody else, because I use my own landing page software to create the landing pages for me. So I don't bother to deal with any of their templates, although sometimes when I'm doing a simple webinar, just a quick one-off, I will use their template. But for something that's important, like a product launch or a course that I'm delivering, I use my own page. And this is the URL. This is where you put in the URL of the page. And there's several steps to this process. One is you have to demark within Webinar Jam Studio which page you're going to for people to register, but then you also have to put a widget on that page that allows the registration module to launch from that page. So I'll show you both of those right now. This will take a few minutes, but it's going to be worthwhile. This page is hosted on basically a WordPress site that I use for all of my sales pages and all of my landing pages. So I actually keep a separate WordPress subdomain where I have all of my different pages for registration and sales. So I'm just going to take you to that page. That's the page right there. And here it is within my WordPress site. So this is what the page looked like. Many of you will recognize it because you saw it as you purchased the product. So it's a description of the description. It's got the key features, and it's got a little video to give people the background of what to expect. Now, when I marketed this particular webinar, I only marketed it to my community who already knew me. I didn't do cold traffic to Facebook, for example, where I was drawing people that didn't know who Steve Dotto was, but instead you all knew who I was before you came, so I was delivering this to what's called a warm audience. So I spend a little less time on this page with the Steve's an awesome guy and a little bit more on what this course is about and why you should be registering. So it was a very simple, kind of a minimal application to a warm audience, to people who already knew me. But do you see right here, do you see this register button? That's the integration back into Webinar Jam Studio. Now if I click on it, it'll probably say that it's already happened. It probably won't resolve properly. Yeah, this webinar has expired, you're too late. But this would launch the webinar subscription tool for us, where you can subscribe, and it begins that whole process of people subscribing to the webinar. So let's just go back to the page itself, and let me show you what happens within that page. Now, I use a tool for my landing pages called Optimize Press, and so if I go in and edit the page, we can see here within the page. One of the reasons I like Optimize Press is it's got really nice integration through to a whole bunch of things, and it's also got this nice WYSIWYG editor that allows me to edit things together. But this little piece of code here is the registration module, which looks like this. Now, I spent years and years in coding class to learn how to write this code. Actually, I didn't. Here's how I got the code. I'm messing with you. Steve's just messing with you. If we go back into the webinar software, into Webinar Jam Studio, when you go into My Webinars, after you've successfully done all of the configuration, so we're now fast forwarding what we're working on. But when we click on the Go Live button here, what we have here is embed registration button to your own site. So this is the registration button that you saw that resolves as the button and then gateways basically into the registration system. That's the button that we've then put on the page. And if we take a look back here at the page, the code that I copied from there is the code that I put in here just as a short code, and what happens, or as an HTML button, and what that does is it resolves as this register now button, so that when people click on this, even though they're on the DottoTech page, the registration engine then communicates with Webinar Jam, and all of the registration information passes through. And actually this begins a cycle of that information, because the information goes to Webinar Jam, so you're properly registered in Webinar Jam, but then it actually then gates it back into my own CRM, which I will show you in a few moments, so that I can track people effectively. In my case, I use Infusionsoft to do that. So that is the process that we do as far as landing pages. If you do it the way that I've shown you here, you can also create split tests of landing pages so that you can try different formats out. You can try ones with videos, one without videos. The bottom line is the marketing side of a webinar, a big part of the effective marketing is making sure that your web landing page converts people into your webinar. So you do have to spend time and energy on that. We won't spend a lot more time talking about that right now, but it is something that you're going to want to spend an awful lot of effort on. Just like how good your graphics are and where you're promoting it and all of those sorts of things, the actual landing page itself is incredibly important in converting people to register for the webinar. It's the first step towards the real engagement. So once you've completed your registration process, you will then have a URL. You will then be able to send people to your landing page in order to register. Now let's walk through the next step of the registration process, because once they've registered and they've put their email address and their name into the registration module, then we begin our relationship with the person who has subscribed to our webinar. And what does that relationship look like? Well, first thing is we need to remind them, and we need to let them know where to go for the webinar and set up some sort of a reminder system, because people will typically forget. So you want a welcome message immediately telling them that they're part of the webinar, thanking them for joining. You might send another few email or two follow-up sequence to prime them for your content, depending on what your marketing strategy is. But all of that can be facilitated here within the Webinar Jam Studio, in this particular case, within their own email autoresponder. Now, you do have a choice here. You have a choice between using their tool to send and receive all of the to send all of the emails, or you could use your own CRM. You could use Infusionsoft or MailChimp or any tool like that to send the information. I choose to use the tool that's built in to Webinar Jam Studio for all immediate communications around the webinar. Long-term follow-up of a funnel of email sequences going on for weeks or even months after a webinar, I will use my own tool for. But for anything relating directly to the webinar, I use this tool, and here is why. Here's an example. So you set it up and you say, I want to send an email immediately after you sign up with a confirmation. And let's edit that and take a look at what that email looks like. The reason I like to use their tool is they've got built into it all of these little pound key, word, pound key. These are short codes. These are little snippets that automatically populate the relevant information. And here's a list of them down below in this kind of yellow area. But what they've done is they've said, you know how an email autoresponder says, hey, Steve, if you put your name in as Steve, it does all of that, plus putting in the title, which it takes from the title that we put in earlier for the webinar, and then the description that we've written, and the date and the time based on the scheduling software, and excuse me, a link to the login page, again with the title and the description and the name of the host. So all of this information is put in. We don't have to type in that the name of the webinar is The Anatomy of a Successful Webinar. The title will be pulled from the Q&A that we did as we filled in each module, working our way through Webinar Jam. So this is an incredibly powerful way to have personalized, relevant, accurate information going out to your audience. Now you can customize any parts of this. The text you can say, you can customize the title, you can do all of those sorts of things here to make it more personal, but the automated system works really well from this perspective. So I send out an immediate welcome message, a pre-webinar reminder 2 hours before, and then a last-minute reminder 15 minutes before, as well as a post-webinar message an hour later. And included in that post-webinar message, I will include with all of my webinars any links that I have that I shared within the webinar itself, and also it will get this replay link, which will send people to the replay depending on how we determine our replay a little bit later on, where we get in the replay module. But they will also get a replay link to the video. So this tool here of the email follow-up, I find to be an incredibly valuable asset. And if you use it properly, you'll increase the show-up rate. The number of people that actually show up live for your webinar will increase. And this is something that you should work long and hard on and figuring out what system works best for you. But this is the system that I use. I don't like to overwhelm people with a lot of emails, so an immediate thank you, a 2-hour reminder, and a 15-minute reminder is what goes out. Now, sometimes you will get more emails than that from me because I might still be promoting the webinar to the rest of my audience, not just the people who've registered, a little bit as well. So I'm sending out a whole series of different emails from different services in the time leading up to the actual delivery of a webinar. So that's the notification system. And you see there the value of all of the previous configuration that we've done. Now we get into our geek hat and we start talking about integration. Integration is how our email software integrates with our webinar software. And this, as you're evaluating any piece of webinar software, is something that you have to do because this integration determines your long-term communication and your long-term relationship with the webinar participant. So the most important thing here, well, there's two, I guess. One of them is the tracking software, tracking systems, which is terrific if you're super sophisticated and you're doing Facebook ads and you want to track the Facebook ads through to see what your conversion rate is on tracking people through from Facebook. I'm not going to be talking about that in this course. It's almost a course on its own because it's more about Facebook and Google ads than it is about webinars, but you've got that integration available to you. What we are going to talk about is email autoresponder integration. And here we've got the ability to choose any of these different tools and to create an API level integration or an application level integration between Webinar Jam Studio or our webinar software and our autoresponder. And I use Infusionsoft. So when I open that up and edit it, what happens is I go through and there's a guide for each one. So each tool is going to be slightly different in how you set up the integration. But once you set up the integration, you can then determine, and it's in what's called deep integration here, you can determine which, first of all, what account it's being connected to, and what happens when people register. So, or when they integrate, or when they, interact with the webinar. So you can see that I can actually create a notification that goes back into Infusionsoft for when they register, when they attend the live webinar, if they miss the webinars. Now, I haven't enabled all of those. I just basically follow if you register for the webinar, but even how long you stayed in the webinar. Now, what this is this is a little code here, which let me just take you into Infusionsoft. And show you where this all comes together. So here is our Infusionsoft installation. And if I go into my CRM here and I go under my settings, into the home settings here and go under our settings, we will see here that we have tags available to us. And these tags are how within Infusionsoft and other CRMs use different techniques, but basically how I can identify what any one contact within Infusionsoft has been interested in or has signed up for of my different properties, because I've got lots of different opportunities. I've got lots of webinars, I've got lots of courses. I want to know what you've signed up for and what you're engaged in. So if we go back here to Webinar Jam, do you see here it says it's tag number 652. So let's go to the tags and see 652 is the anatomy of a webinar, 8/18, the date, rescheduled, because we did have our first technical issue when we first delivered that webinar, but we see there how many people have registered. And I can see here the number of people, 73 people, actually have that tag on their account. So you can actually track the people through who are registering. Now, the beauty here is later on, I can just send an email to those 73 people if I choose by using the tools that are built into Infusionsoft. So this is where the long-term communication becomes very powerful. And if you take a look here, if you also say, if somebody missed the webinar, this is, and I think this is a great way to consider doing some more successful webinars. If they missed the live webinar, how about adding another tag so I can send a separate email through? So I noticed you missed the webinar. Sorry that you did that. Here's a replay so you can actually change the verbiage of your follow-up. That is a more sophisticated delivery mechanism or webinar system, but it's one well worth considering. And if I had a little more time, I would like to incorporate those extra features myself. But it gives you an idea of how this email autoresponder integration can benefit us and our customers as we move along. So once you set up that integration, you're ready to proceed on. Now the integration, so here, let me walk you through the narrative of exactly what happens then when somebody registers for one of our webinars. If they registered for, and what happened to you, is you were brought to this page here again. Let me just put that page in because this here. So here's the process that happens. I promoted a webinar which you were interested in or somebody's interested in, and they go to this page that you see before us. This page gives them the information. It's hosted on my own site. It gives them the information that they're interested in. They determine that they want to buy or they want to sign up for the webinar, and they click on Register Now. That then opens a gateway effectively to Webinar Jam Studio. When they enter their information into Webinar Jam Studio, that information is captured in Webinar Jam Studio and the notifications begin. As soon as they sign up, they receive an email notifying them that they've signed up, welcoming them, giving them the link to the webinar, and also putting them in a sequence so they receive more emails downstream with the 2-hour and the 15-minute warning. So there, we've got all of that in place. But that's not all. Because we've also set up these integrations here, Infusionsoft, my CRM, excuse me, also receives notification that that person has registered, and it adds a tag to their contact if they are already in my Infusionsoft installation, if they're already in my database. If not, you are added to my database, and whatever follow-up sequence I have there is also invoked. It's absolutely brilliant how all of these things come together with just a simple person entering their email address and their name in order to register for a webinar. That's one of the keys to long-term relationship with our audience members. Once we go to the next stage, which is the thank you, you can add, that's the thank you for registering. You can send them to a custom message, and this is if you have a sophisticated onboarding where you're going to be telling them this is what you have to prepare before the webinar, this is what to think about for the webinar, this is what we're going to be talking about. If you want to do all that kind of information, you can do that. And this also provides a thank you for after the webinar. Actually, if I go in, I've never done a thank you, so let me make sure that it's not before or after. Embed your own custom for post-registration. That is, this is right. This is for the post-registration link. So this is not for after the webinar itself is delivered, but after they've registered for the webinar that this information comes. Then, once all of that is complete, you can then step forward to the live segment. And the live segment is, I think, to me, is one of the things that allows me to deliver higher value webinars, because within the live, we have the ability to, well, there's some ability to put a countdown on the landing page, which I don't think is a big deal, but pre-configure webinar polls. So you can set up actual polls that you can insert in the webinar at any point, so you can ask your audience question. Especially valuable in sales webinars when you're going to be selling a product, getting an idea of who the audience is and starting them to move along the path. You can also incorporate webinar offers, which allow you to actually put a link forward that has a click that allows people to purchase something or to sign up for something else or to go to another landing page. So you have the ability to manage the flow of where people are going to or what they're signing up for. And this one here, which is to pre-configure video injections, which to me is essential to delivering good webinars. Now, think back to watching the webinar replay. Now, because we use Google Hangouts on Air as the basis, and Google Live or YouTube Live will have a similar kind of quality issue, the actual streaming quality of video coming during the live webinar is only so-so. It's okay, but not great. But it's not good enough to do real demos where you're moving from menu to menu, zooming in and out of different screens, or even reading what happens on the screen. Typically speaking, doing screen sharing with webinar software isn't the quality that you're going to want for any tutorial type work. So I'm able, though, using the same technique as I'm using right now to deliver this course content to you, I create a screencast video with my main presentation in it. And you'll notice partway through that webinar, the quality improved because I went to my screencast. Because it is already compressed, it's uploaded, it's served from YouTube or Vimeo or some other source, and then it is delivered in very, very high quality, which means we can actually do proper tutorial stuff, zoom in and out on content. I can include my face as a part of the video injection at that point there, which adds extra levels of engagement. All of that happens because we are doing what's called a hybrid webinar, where we mix a live session segment with the pre-recorded segment. Now, I take advantage of that in another way, is as soon as my video starts running, I jump over into chat and I increase the information density of any webinar by answering questions in chat and helping things go along to add value and making sure we're respecting your time as much as possible. So all of that is possible because of these pre-configured video injections. Now, a little bit later on the module, I'll show you very quickly how I create my screencasts, and of course, I've got free courses and paid courses on how I create my videos, which will also be listed out within the resources page here in this course if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the art of screencasting, which is, of course, near and dear to my heart. Once we have done all of these things, so let me just get out of all of this, we're ready to finally determine how the webinar is going to be played back. So you can enable a webinar replay page, which will allow you to do a full replay, what they call a replica replay of the webinar, so that people can still sign up. You can view the webinar, including the chat going down the side. Now, this is the thin edge of the wedge in creating automated webinars. And a lot of people will use this basic technology of these webinar replays in order to create a full on-demand replay of the webinar as though it was happening live. Now, I have no issues with that. I think that's a tremendous way to leverage the effort you put into delivering a webinar. Where I do have a big issue is when people start to present those webinar replays as though they're live without indicating to people in any way, shape, or form that they are pre-recorded. I think that's tantamount to lying. And in fact, Webinar Jam Studio has a sister product called EverWebinar, which you can see that I haven't actually got enabled here, but is available to me, where you can actually create a webinar which will look to people to be live. There'll be a fake count of the number of people in it. There'll be a chat rolling by live that looks and appears as though it's live, and you won't be able to tell that it's pre-recorded unless you happen to know what you're looking for. And you can actually set that up. I would encourage all of you that participate in the DottoTech brand to avoid that temptation, because even though those things work, I think it's disingenuous for that to be an introduction to your audience where the first thing out of your mouth is basically a lie where you say, I'm delivering this live, but in fact it is pre-recorded. And many of my contemporaries do that process where they will actually deliver webinars that look, to all intents and purposes, are live, and they do nothing to dissuade you from the notion, or they outright tell you it's live when it isn't. And that's me. This is now me getting off my soapbox. But you do have the opportunity to create a valuable replay using these tools, and as long as you're upfront about the fact that it is a replay, it can still have tremendous value to your audience moving along. And the final step along this, the Webinar Jam Studio, is setting up a monetization system. And in this particular case, I did charge to register my webinar. And what happened in that particular case is there's a little bit of a dance that we go back and forth between Infusionsoft, in this case, and Webinar Jam Studio, where I created a sales page in Infusionsoft, and the people then paid. The money came into Infusionsoft, into my payment gateway in Infusionsoft, and then people were redirected back towards a registration page to make sure they actually registered for the webinar. So that is how that all comes together as well. And most webinar tools now will allow you to create some sort of a registration fee if you happen to have a revenue model attached to your webinars. So that is the basic process of setting up the webinar. Once you've done all of this, you can go back out into your webinar software here, and you can get you've got the registration link already, and at any point you can go in and you can see how things are going by tracking the analytics, going in and seeing exactly how many people have registered. But with my model, of course, you can also track that within Infusionsoft to see how the registration is going. And when you're ready to go live, you click on this Go Live button, and then it brings up the ability for you to be able to share, to send an email with links that will launch the administrative control panel or the live room for both all of the different people that are registered to be part of the webinar as presenters or as producers. So that is the basic setup for Webinar Jam Studio, and these same tenets apply to almost any good webinar delivery application. One of the things I do like about Webinar Jam Studio that sets it apart from a lot of the other webinar packages is how it adheres to the producer-presenter metaphor for presenting webinars. When we did television, when we did radio, my responsibility as on-air host was content delivery, entertainment value, timing, keeping the flow going, those sorts of things. I was all concentrated outward-facing on what was being broadcast to our community. Behind the scenes, I had a producer, director, people who were concerned about the interstitial content, the stuff that we were putting in and placing within the webinar, graphics, handling calls, talking to the community, setting up the next guest, this sort of stuff. So this division of labor between host, who was then able to concentrate 100% of their attention on the content, and the administrator, who was focusing their content on the facilitation of the webinar, is a great division of labor. Now, the way that Webinar Jam Studio does this, and I'm hoping other webinar packages will pick up on this model as we go on, is if we click here, I've just created a little test webinar right now that's running, which will take you into in a moment, and then I'll show you actually the results of a real one that we've delivered. But when we look at the presenter links, we have a live room and a control panel link available to us. The live room looks like the webinar. This is what we're seeing for the live room, and this is what I would be ultimately broadcasting when the time comes to deliver the webinar. Or if I was to go live right now and start the broadcast, if people were subscribed, they would be there. Now on the right-hand side here within the Webinar Jam interface, I've got the ability to view chat, see the people in the room, and see a lot of the different controls, but it's not really my job as the presenter to be worrying about all of those things. Instead, if we take a look here at the control panel, we see an administration console for the webinar that the producer can see, which includes real-time chat happening, be able to identify questions, to be able to view all of the participants in the kind of the metrics of what's happening. Some nice additional features is send out an email to invite all of the people who've registered who haven't yet showed up for the webinar to remind them, or send them an SMS if you've captured their phone information. The ability to launch and load polls or create new polls offers, and also playback videos. So a person in this environment has the ability to be able to view everything happening within the webinar, watch the chat happening in real time. And what I'll do right now is I will start to play back a real-time recording that I did of our last webinar, and you'll see the chat happening in real time. You'll see exactly what happens in the console. So while the presenter is presenting, the producer can be here in the console managing all of this different content, and including getting to the point where it's time to, you can see that we can see just how many people are in the room. We can see people entering the room. We can see the chat, respond to the chat, identify different chat as questions so that they're identified for people to see. And if they choose to, they can also insert polls, video, the video playing, or include other offers. To me, this control over the live webinar experience goes a long ways to serving two purposes: making the webinar far more engaging, actually three purposes, I guess. Making the webinar more engaging for our audience, giving a security net and confidence to the presenter allowing them to concentrate just on the delivery of content to do their best performance possible, and also serve whatever your end goal is for the webinar, in making sure that at the right time offers are inserted, calls to action happen, and all of those different inclusions are included within the webinar. As I say, this is unique currently to Webinar Jam, but I'm really hoping that other applications are going to catch up and recognize this division of labor between presenter and producer. All right, let's talk about the hybrid webinar, which is where we use a video recording, a screencast recording, and we insert that within our webinar as an asset within the webinar. And this is the webinar. Here's the actual hybrid portion of the webinar from this from the anatomy of a successful webinar. And what we have here is we have a recording that I created, which is a slideshow in the background at the beginning. Now I've incorporated my video in the foreground here, which is a technique that I use an awful lot, but you can do it certainly without that. There's a slideshow here, and then actually at some point here within this video, we go to a demo, which you'll see here, where we start going to screens and shots. Now, I'm using the tool, I'm using the tool ScreenFlow on a Mac to create this particular hybrid webinar, or this video. You could also use Camtasia or any other good screencasting application. So here is the process that I go through to create the video that you see. Now, if you want more detail on how to do this, I would suggest that you sign up for a free course that I have, which teaches you how I create my videos, which will walk you through this entire process. But quickly, here is what happens. First of all, I've written the narrative for whatever it is that I'm going to be presenting. So I've got the presentation pretty much set and ready to go. And what I'll do is I'll start recording using a screencast, which will record the audio from my microphone, the video from my webcam, and the screen background from behind me here. Now, I won't worry too much about the slideshow content while I do this, because here's my PowerPoint, or a keynote. In this case, it's a keynote presentation. Here's the presentation and the different speaking notes in the different screens that I would be working with through the entire presentation. The reason I don't worry about the slides is I want to just concentrate on the delivery of the content and the energy in the presentation. And what I can do is I go back afterwards and I record the slides after, and then I edit them together with my video in order to make it look all proper. So here's exactly what happens. Here within ScreenFlow, I record. Once I've done the recording and I've recorded the video, then I've got this track which you see here at the top, which has my audio and my video in the track. Then I go back and I record separately the screens as a presentation. What I do is here I go into full slideshow mode, and I go from slide to slide, and I just record each screen, and I pause for 5 or 6 seconds on each screen. Then I take that video recording and I insert it as a track here within ScreenFlow, and you see that here at the bottom. And what I do is I create freeze frames of each of the slides while I'm speaking to that content, and then allow the transition to run from slide to slide as I move from slide to slide through it. So this is basically a series of still slides that I time by listening to the audio. As I play it back, I time when I'm going to transition from slide to slide. So that gives me the slideshow content for the video. It's very easy to create a really professionally produced slideshow presentation to include in a webinar. So the benefit of doing this is you have complete control over the content, complete control over the time, so that if you have any mistakes, if you get off in the weeds in your description, or you get off script in any way, shape, or form, you can use video editing to bring you back in and to compress the amount of time that the video takes, and to basically consolidate the information and just add value to it. Once I'm through that video recording of the slideshow part, the benefit of being into the screens is, of course, we can go into each of the screens and we can zoom in and out on the content, as you see me doing right here. We can zoom in and out so that we can help illustrate our points more effectively, and we do that through the video editing technique that I use for creating all of my screencasts. And again, for more on that, I encourage you to take one of my other courses where I cover it. I've got free courses on it, so I'll put links in here for you to sign up for those if you want to learn more about the screencasting technique. Once all of this is done, once all of this is complete, you then export the video, and once the video is exported, you can then take that video and you can upload it to any one of a variety of different YouTube or Vimeo sites, any place that you can store it for streaming. Once it's been uploaded for streaming, this is the video that I exported, you take the URL from that video, copy the link address, you take the URL from that video, and we bring it into our webinar software. In this particular case, if we're bringing it into Webinar Jam Studio, we bring it into Webinar Jam Studio, and if we go along in the configuration, we find the live node here. It might be called something else in other webinar packages, and there we say use a pre-configured video injection. When I choose that pre-configured video injection, I then put the URL, and this is it right here. I put the URL of that video in here. You have to put the exact time that it runs specifically, and you save it. Then when you're in your actual live presentation, you can then inject that video. You can start it manually playing, and then it will interrupt the live distribution of video with this pre-recorded video at a higher quality, timed out, allow you to go into chat if you choose to go into chat. When it ends, the webinar software automatically kicks you back into live presentation mode. So that's how we do a hybrid webinar. As with everything in the online world, analytics, knowing what is happening, is crucial to learning how to deliver better webinars and improve on your performance in any specific webinar. And Webinar Jam Studio and most other webinar packages have some form of analytics available to us. So let's dive in and take a look at some of the reports that we can get out of analytics and some of the knowledge that we can glean from analytics. Now, how this works within Webinar Jam Studio is we select whichever webinar we want to look at the analytics for, and they break it down by individual webinars here. So let's go to this one here, which is Screencasting Secrets for Course Design. This was an interesting webinar. This was kind of a jointly presented webinar with the community from the software service Thinkific. So actually these are the people who have the course delivery application, which we're using, that you're in right now as you're going through this course content. And they invited their community out to a webinar where I would teach them how I do my screencasting, and it ended up being a very successful webinar. We did quite well with it. So let's take a look at the analytics. So you first of all select the event, and then you can go in and you can analyze within the webinar, the traffic to the webinar, monetization, notifications, registrants, and attendees, which is just basically a list of them and when they registered. So you have these different main areas. But let's start with traffic. And this is nice because what this does is this shows us how many unique visitors we had that looked at the landing page that we created and basically viewed it. The sign-up rate, the number of people that actually signed up for the webinar, how many people showed up for the webinar, and then how many people showed up for the replay. And in my mind, this was a very successful webinar. When we take a look at an 84% sign-up rate, that means that only 15% of the people who visited the landing page did not bother registering for the webinar. Now, a couple of things that we learned from analytics when we look at this. One, we obviously had a good performing landing page, but two, we also set expectations properly in our promotional materials when we're inviting people to visit the landing page, because they didn't come there, they weren't disappointed with what they saw, so they were willing, and there was a trust built where they were willing to register for that webinar. So that I'm going to give myself a nice a solid A, and also the people from Thinkific for setting things up properly, a solid A for that. So very pleased with that. And you, if you get that higher sign-up rate, good on you, but don't fear too much if it's lower. For example, for our paid webinars, the rate is going to be much, much, much smaller because we're charging for it. This was a free webinar. The next is the actual number of live attendees and the number of replay attendees. These are really interesting statistics. From what I hear from other webinar presenters, anything over 20% show up rate for your webinar is going to be a rate that you should be pleased with. I aim for 30%, and here we had a 37% show up rate. Here's a couple of factors that I've learned. One is, don't promote your webinar 2 weeks in advance or 3 weeks in advance. I suppose for revenue webinars that's okay if people are paying money, but if it's a free webinar, people are interested in it kind of as you get very close when they sign up. So I start taking registrations for my webinar typically about a week in advance, maybe a little less than a week in advance, and then I heavily promote it 3 days in advance in those last couple of days. So you'll notice when you receive emails from me that you might hear one mention of a webinar out about a week, but then in the 2 and 3 days and day of webinar, you'll be getting emails from me each of those days. Usually just one email a day, but you'll be hearing from me each of those days inviting you to join the webinar. And that is what I find is the highest. First of all, we get the best return. People tend to sign up very well for that. But also, since I started doing such a short lead-in, I've noticed my show-up rate percentage is much higher. So when it's top of mind, when people know what they're doing tomorrow or even today, they tend to show up for the webinar. That's a really important point. The replay rate is basically depending, I guess, on how relevant your content is in people's lives. I don't know how you change that or improve it other than by sending out more emails or making sure that people recognize that the replay is there. But that rate is also quite good. So between the two, though, when we add up 446 and 382, we had 70% of the people show up to our webinar, which I am thrilled with as far as the performance goes. The next set of analytics that you get is what happens within the webinar. It tells you the length of the webinar. The average time in the room tells you your retention rate. Really important statistic. If you put on a webinar, a free webinar, and your webinar lasts for an hour, and the average length of time in the room is 18 minutes or 20 minutes, you probably have a problem with your content because people aren't getting what they expected coming to your webinar. The fact that they stayed right through the main presentation, right into our Q&A, is a really good sign for me, the average length. So the way that I structure my webinars is I try and keep them to an hour's worth of content. I will go longer than an hour, but it's all Q&A. The base content, all of the main value, and any calls to action have happened in the first hour. You see the average amount of time in the replay room, far less. Live webinars, far more engaging than replays. So I'm not really all that disappointed with that statistic, but that's something that you have to be prepared to live with, is you're going to have less time in the replay room. Next, it talks about the engagement, is the percentage of the employees that saw the full live webinar, 53%. Happy with that. 15% in the replay. Again, not much you can do about that. Then as you go through, if you have offers or anything else that you've asked people to click on, you can gain that information here as well. The other really interesting statistic here, or the other interesting feature, is the ability to download the chat history. When you do a hybrid webinar of the style that we do, the ability to be able to pull that chat and then incorporate it, because so many interesting little tidbits are shared in the chat, I think is quite valuable. So I always include the chat history in the follow-up content, either by email. I'll send it you out. We first of all include it in the webinar replay, but we also make it available as a separate document. For example, if you look inside this course, you will find the chat from the last webinar we delivered, from the webinar that's the base content for this course. So I think that's quite valuable content as well for you to add. So having all of this different analytical information and going through and looking at how your webinar performed, and then in thinking within the content of your webinar, what you can do to increase the most important engagement statistics. Increasing your sign-up rate, increasing your show-up rate, increasing your length of time in the room and the engagement. And then if you do have offers, increasing the number of people that click on those offers. Ultimately, if it leads to sales, of course, increasing sales. That is all crucial information that I think spending time in your analytics is just makes it's a good exercise to do. I do this in my YouTube videos, and I do it for all of my webinars as well. Hello, folks. Sorry about that. I think we finally got it solved. Is there? Yeah. If you restart, let me go here. There we are. Now you're starting to come into the room, I believe. My apologies. We had a real technical issue here. Everything just kind of went sideways on us there for a few moments. And well, there you have it. What do you do when technically it all goes south and the webinar doesn't work? Kind of the greatest fear for all people hosting a webinar. And the nature of technology determines that at some point when you're delivering a webinar, it's gonna go sideways and it's not going to work the way that you planned, either catastrophically for the entire webinar or for individuals where they're having difficulty accessing and they're having difficulty with their feed, which causes a massive amount of disruption. So when we delivered this webinar in the first place, we had some issues. I'm not too sure what happened with, it was actually a Google Hangout on Air issue, and I didn't have a broadcast button in this webinar that you're seeing kind of the replay of right now. And you'll see, I'll play a few more minutes of how I reacted. So we'll give it a few seconds here and we'll see if we can get people in. I'd like to figure out if I'm going to send a quick email to them all.
That's what I was going to suggest. Looks like Leah suggested that too. Great idea, Leah.
Okay, so now I'm going into an Infusionsoft and creating an email instantly. Well, this should be smooth. There's a few more people coming in. Hey, everybody! This is the secret of a successful webinar. The secret of a successful webinar is not.
We're teaching you what not to do today.
Oh, the irony! Oh, the irony! Okay. Oh, I'm weeping. I'm weeping. Here we go. Let me just go in and say, how are we doing?
Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
Okay. And I think that the keys to understand when you do have a webinar that doesn't go off as planned, when you do have technical issues, is that you can't take the responsibility on yourself. When we get flustered, when we get frustrated with it, is when we start looking for perfection on our side and thinking that people are kind of judging us and that we're letting the entire webinar community down. Now, there is going to be a natural part of you that has that reaction, is the fact that, oh, shoot, I should be better than this. It shouldn't happen to me. But it does happen to me. It happens to me, Steve Dotto, and it will happen to you at some point. So being straightforward, upfront with your community, and dealing with it as best you can is far and away the best practice. But the thing to avoid is panic and to get the kind of that tunnel vision of with the world closing in around you. And I realize that's a difficult thing to do. But if you already have a game plan of you know what you're going to do if the webinar does have an issue, I think that eliminates a lot of the confusion and a lot of the concern. So first thing is, of course, preparation. making sure that you have done everything you can to avoid the issues, testing your links, testing your webinar beforehand. Another thing that I do at the start of each one of my webinars is I make sure I tell people if it goes wrong, if we have issues, don't worry, we have this game plan. There's going to be a replay coming up later, etc. So making sure that you articulate your game plan to your community gives them some comfort. Because the big negative in this whole thing is you do waste other people's time a lot as they're waiting for your webinar to come back online. Knowing when to bail, knowing when to say, you know what, this isn't going to work today, firing off an email to everybody saying we're going to reschedule, which is what we did with this one. As I actually, once I reached a certain point of no return, we actually did the webinar, but I also sent out an email saying we are going to do a replay. So if you couldn't stick around, if you had too many technical issues, we're going to do the replay, which is the webinar that's actually a part of this particular course, is the replay webinar because of where we had the problems. Also removing as much as possible the pressure of managing the webinar from the webinar host and putting it on the producer. Now in our particular case of the way DottoTech works, just because I'm the technical guy behind it all, I take on a lot of that mantle myself because I want to know what's going on. But if you're a content person, making sure you have a technical person that's backing you up and pushing things ahead is a good plan. So speed, reacting quickly to things, is another big part of the way that you can handle a webinar that's gone sideways. So having a ability to send out a mass email to your entire webinar community, everybody that signed up all at once when you do have a problem, because if the webinar itself isn't working, email might be the only way to communicate with them. Having that queued up and ready to go, even if you haven't written the email, but if you're saying, you know, we are having a technical problem here, this is our plan. We'll get in touch with you within an hour and let you know when this new scheduled one is, or even announcing at that point there when that new schedule is. Those are all options that you have when a webinar does go south. So it happens to the best of us. Don't let it get you down. Be upfront with your community, telling them exactly what happens. And in some ways, you can not necessarily turn a negative into a positive, but if you deal with it with a little bit of class, a little bit of confidence, and you don't let it rattle you, I believe that you end up, in the end, actually enhancing your brand and your reputation with your community. Because everyone knows that technology occasionally lets us down.